She was 21 years old. She had been out of her uncle's house for 6 days, and she had exactly $9 left to her name when she walked into the land office in the town of Harrow Bend, Montana, and asked if there was anything for sale that nobody wanted. The man behind the counter, a wiry, sun-dried clerk named Arthur Fenwick, looked at her over the rim of his spectacles, the way you might look at a stray dog that had somehow wandered into church. He took her in, the worn travel coat, the canvas satchel slung across one shoulder, the careful way she held herself, like she was bracing for something she'd learned to expect. "There's one property," he said slowly, pulling a ledger from beneath the counter. "Old cooperage on the south edge of town. Sits right on the Sallow River. Been empty going on 14 years. "Why 14 years?" she asked. He set his spectacles on the counter and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "People around here call it the drowned man's shop," he said. "The fellow who built it, Henrick Claes, died in the river out back during the spring flood of 1879. His wife cleared out within the year. 3 families tried to take it on after that. None of them stayed a full season." He paused. "Folks say the place holds bad luck like a bucket holds water." The young woman was quiet for a moment. Her name was Orin Voss, not the kind of name people expected when they saw her face, and she knew it. Her father had wanted a son and had already picked the name before she arrived. And her mother, who died 3 days after the birth, had never had the chance to suggest otherwise. She had grown up in her uncle's household and Billings answering to it, without complaint, which was, perhaps, a small preview of the patience she had learned to carry with her. "How much?" she asked. Fenwick squinted. "County just wants to clear it. $9 for the deed and the 5 acres that run with it." It was every cent she had. She thought of the 6 days of walking. She thought of the 2 nights she had slept in a hay barn outside of Lewistown, with her coat pulled tight and the sound of mice in the walls. She thought of her uncle's face when he had told her, very calmly, over breakfast, that she had turned 21 and his obligation to her was finished. That his new wife, Lorraine, needed the room. That the world was full of opportunities for a young woman willing to work. She had not cried then, and she did not cry now. She had learned very early that tears spent on things you cannot change are tears wasted. "I'll take it," she said. Fenwick stared at her for a long moment, then slowly opened the ledger. "Now, before we follow Orin down to that river, we want to tell you something. Because this story isn't really about a building, or about bad luck, or even about $9. It is about what we find when we are willing to look honestly at the places other people have decided to be afraid of. If you've ever looked at something broken and seen what it could be instead of what it is, this story is for you. Stay with us." To understand Orin Voss, you have to understand Clement Dre. Clement Dre was a blacksmith. Not the kind who does horseshoes and hinge repairs and calls it a day, but the old kind. A man who understood iron and fire as a language, who could read the color of heated metal the way a sailor reads the sky. He had a forge at the back of his property on the eastern edge of Billings, a low stone building that smelled of coal smoke and iron scale and the particular dry heat that lives close to a working fire. He had no children. He had outlived his wife by 11 years and his younger brother by 3. He was 64 years old and had the deliberate, economical movements of a man who has learned not to waste motion. He was also Orin's nearest neighbor, and when she was 9 years old, he noticed her standing at the fence that separated their properties, watching him work. He did not wave her over. He did not call out. He simply one afternoon set a small piece of scrap iron and a pair of tongs on the fence post and went back to his anvil. She stood there for a long time before she picked them up. Then she climbed the fence and followed him inside. That was how it began. For the next 11 years, the forge was the truest home she had. Her uncle's house was a place she slept and ate and did chores. The forge was a place she learned to think. Clement Dre taught her how to read the fire. The white heat that means the iron is ready to move. The dull orange that means it has already cooled past usefulness. He taught her how to draw out a bar of iron with a cross-peen hammer, how to punch a hole without cracking the metal, how to use the hardy to cut a clean edge. He taught her the lost art of making barrel hoops, the particular curve, the cold set, the way you lap the joint and clinch it so it will never slip. He taught her the names of tools she would not find in any modern catalog. He spoke very little while he worked. But he watched her, and when she made a mistake, he would simply do the thing correctly and set the work back in front of her without comment. When she was 16, he gave her a center punch he had made himself. The body was turned iron, perfectly balanced, the tip hardened and ground to a fine, precise point. The head was wrapped in a grip of buffalo horn, worn smooth with years of use. It fit her hand as though it had been made for it. He told her, "A tool that fits your hand is the beginning of everything." She kept it in the chest pocket of her coat, wrapped in a small square of oilcloth. He died on a Thursday morning in November, 2 months before her 20th birthday. He died quietly, at his workbench, in the middle of repairing a set of wagon tire irons, and no one found him until the following afternoon. He left no will of consequence. His property went to a distant nephew in St. Louis who had never visited, but he had left on the workbench beside him a short note addressed to Orin in his cramped, unhurried handwriting. It said only, "You know the work. Trust the work." She folded it and put it in her coat pocket next to the center punch. The cooperage sat on a narrow strip of flat ground between the road and the Sallow River, about a quarter-mile south of the edge of Harrow Bend proper. The path to it was barely visible, little more than a deer trail, through waist-high grass and stands of young cottonwood that had grown up unchallenged along the bank. Orin pushed through it slowly, her satchel catching on branches, the sound of the river growing louder as she went. Then she saw it. It was a low, long building, built of rough-cut timber and river stone, with a wide overhang along the south face that had served, once, as a covered workyard. Half of the overhang had collapsed. The posts rotted at their bases, and the roof boards piled in a gray, weathered heap. The main building still stood, though. The ridgeline was true. The stone foundation, which ran along the river-facing wall, was solid and tight-mortared, not a stone shifted out of place. The timbers of the main walls were sound, darkened with weather to the color of old pewter, but still hard as iron when she knocked her knuckles against them. One of the two windows was shuttered and intact. The other had lost its shutter and was open to the weather, a ragged square of darkness. The door was standing open, not hanging, but open, propped in place by a small river stone, as though someone had gone inside meaning to come right back and never returned. She stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The interior was a single long room with a low loft at the far end. The floor was packed earth, hard as brick. Along the south wall ran a long workbench, still solid, its surface scarred and dented with decades of hammer and chisel marks. Iron brackets on the wall above it had once held tools. She could see the dark silhouettes where the metal had left stains against the wood. Most of the tools themselves were gone, taken by the families who had tried and failed to make something of the place, or simply carried off by scavengers over the years. But the forge was still there. Not a blacksmith's forge, a cooper's fire hearth, the long, low stone and clay structure along the north wall, where barrel staves had been bent and shaped over heat and steam. It was a different kind of fire than she was used to, but fire was fire. Heat was heat. She understood the language. She walked slowly around the room, running her fingers along the workbench, testing the loft ladder, solid, though two rungs needed replacing, and crouching down to look at the base of stone foundation where it met the riverbank wall. The mortar was old but good. Someone had built this place with the intention of it lasting. Through the missing window, she could hear the river. Not the roaring, dangerous sound she'd been half expecting. The river was running quiet now, a wide, shallow braid over smooth stones in the April light. A heron stood motionless at the far bank. She had $9. She had the deed, signed and witnessed, folded in her satchel. She had a center punch, a traveling coat, one change of clothes, and 11 years of knowledge in her hands. She closed the prop door, set her satchel on the workbench, and looked around the room with the particular kind of attention she had learned from Clement Dre. Not at what was missing, but at what was there. There was a great deal there. The first 2 weeks were the hardest, not because of the work, but because of the cold. April in northern Montana is not the gentle, warming month that people imagine it to be. The nights dropped below freezing, and without a functioning hearth, the cooperage held the chill like a stone cellar. She slept in the loft with her coat over her blanket, and woke each morning to see her breath in the air above her. But she worked. She was up before the light, and she worked until she couldn't see. She started with the collapsed overhang, not because it was the most urgent problem, but because the fallen boards and posts gave her the material she needed to begin making repairs on the less visible damage. She pried the soundboards free of the rotted ones, stacking them carefully by length. She salvaged the iron fasteners, knocking them free with a hammer she borrowed from Arthur Fenwick at the land office, who loaned it without comment and accepted it back 2 days later without comment as well. She re-chinked the gaps in the north wall, where the wind came through, using a mixture of clay from the riverbank, dried grass, and a small amount of the lime she bought from the general store, run by a broad, direct woman named Petra Stovall. The store sat at the main intersection of Harrow Bend, which was not a large intersection by any measure. It commanded 2 dirt roads and a hitching post. But Petra Stovall ran it with the focused efficiency of someone who understood exactly what she had and was not interested in apologizing for its scale. When Orin came in for the lime, she set her coins on the counter. Petra looked at them, then looked at her. "You're the one that bought the Claes place," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Orin said. "What are you fixing to do with it?" "Work in it," Orin said. Petra considered this for a moment. "What kind of work?" "Iron work, mostly. Some coopering if I can source the timber, whatever the town needs." Another silence. Petra weighed out the lime without further comment, but when she pushed the bag across the counter, she had added a small paper twist of salt to the order. She met Orin's eyes. "For the chinking," she said. "It helps it set." Orin thanked her, and Petra nodded, and that was the whole of it. The hearth became functional in the 3rd week, after 2 full days of cleaning out the accumulated debris of a decade and a half. Leaves, bird nests, the skeleton of something small, and, at the very base of the firebox, where the old fire clay had cracked and settled, a piece of flat river slate about the size of a dinner plate that had slid down from the upper portion of the hearth structure and landed face down in the ash. She almost discarded it, but something about the weight of it was wrong, heavier than it looked, and when she turned it over, she saw that the flat face had been smoothed and that there was something scratched into its surface. She carried it to the doorway to look at it in the light. It was not writing, or not exactly. It was a series of lines, carefully incised, that formed a diagram, a pattern of curved and straight lines that she studied for a long time before she understood what she was looking at. It was the pattern for bending a barrel stave. Not just any pattern, but a precise one, with measurements scratched in small, deliberate numerals beside each line. The arc of the bend, the length of the taper, the width of the crow's groove that would hold the head. It was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had recorded the most important thing they knew in a medium that would last. Not pap, not wood, but stone. At the bottom of the diagram, in the same careful hand, were 4 words. H. Claes, Harrow Bend, 1874. 5 years before the flood that took him. She sat down on the threshold with the slate across her knees and looked at it for a long time. Henrick Claes had built this place. He had built it well, with good stone and sound timber and an eye toward permanence. He had worked here for at least 5 years before the river took him. He had, at some point, scratched his most important knowledge into a piece of river slate and set it into the base of his hearth, where the heat would preserve it and the stone would endure. She thought of Clement Dre at his workbench, the notes beside him. "You know the work, trust the work." She thought of the 4 families who had come to this building since Henrick Claes died, who had maybe looked at this same hearth, seen only the damage, and never dug down to the bottom. She thought about the kind of person who carves their knowledge into stone before the worst happens. Someone who understood that the work itself was the legacy. Not the building, not the business, not the name above the door, the knowledge, the pattern, the precise, careful set of instructions for how to make a thing that would hold. She cleaned the slate carefully with a rag dampened in river water, set it on the workbench where she could see it, and went back to work. It took her 6 weeks to make the first barrel. She had no staves. She had to split them from green ash she bought from a woodlot outside of town, a transaction that required most of the small wage she earned in the 4th week, helping a local farmer named Webb Sorrells reset fence posts along his north property line. Webb Sorrells was a lean, quiet man who did not ask her questions and paid exactly what he had promised. When she came back to the fence 2 days later with a borrowed post-hole digger, he glanced at the work she had already done and said only, "You drove those posts plumb." It was the highest compliment she had received in weeks, and she was aware, with some wryness, that she had received it from a man she had known for 4 days. She bent the staves over the fire, hearth the way Henrick Claes's diagram instructed, and the way she had once seen done in a picture in a book, slowly, with heat and moisture, coaxing the wood rather than forcing it. She made 3 hoops from the flat bar iron she had in her satchel, the bar stock she had been carrying since Billings because she had not been willing to leave it behind, knowing she might need it. She used the center punch to mark the rivet points, drove the rivets with the hammer, and crimped them over. She made mistakes. The first set of staves cracked at the bend. She had rushed the heat. She split them up for kindling and started again. The second set bent true, but her crow's groove was too shallow, and the head she cut from a piece of salvage pine did not seat right. She adjusted. On the 3rd attempt, she assembled a barrel that held water. She rolled it out to the road and left it there with a piece of paper tacked to it that barrel for sale, see the cooperage. South of town. A farmer bought it the next morning before she had finished breakfast. By midsummer, things had quietly changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make for a rousing story of triumph. More like the way a room changes when someone opens a window. A gradual shift in the quality of the air. Small and undramatic, and impossible to precisely identify, but real. Petra Stovall had begun adding a small item to Orin's orders without comment. A twist of tea one week. A handful of dried apples the next. She never acknowledged doing it, and Orin never mentioned it, but it had become a reliable feature of the transactions, and both of them understood what it meant. Webb Sorrells sent his neighbor with a broken wagon wheel rim and a note saying Orin did good ironwork if the rim was evidence of anything. The neighbor, a voluble older man named Calvin Fitch, watched her work for 20 minutes before she asked him, politely, to wait outside. He did so without taking offense, and when she handed him the repaired rim, he turned it over in his hands and said, "Henrick Claes used to do work like this. Good tight clinch." He said it casually, but he was watching her face. "I heard he was skilled," she said. "Best in the territory," Calvin Fitch said. "Shame what happened." He looked back at the cooperage. "You got the fire going again in there?" "Yes," he nodded slowly. Wondered if anybody ever would. He paid her and left. She stood in the doorway after he had gone and thought about that. Wondered if anybody ever would. As though the town had been waiting, not with hope exactly, but with the particular quality of attention you give to something you have not quite given up on. She thought of the slate on the workbench. H. Claes, Harrow Bend, 1874. She thought of a man building something with his best skill and his best knowledge. Building it to last, and then the river rising in the spring dark, and the building standing empty for 14 years, while the work inside it waited. Some things wait a long time. It was Calvin Fitch, as it turned out, who told her about the letters. He came back in August, this time without a repair job, just with his hat in his hands and a slightly guilty expression. When they cleared out the Claes property, after the widow left, he said, there were some things in the building they didn't know what to do with. Papers, mostly. Old account books. A few personal items. The pastor at the time boxed them up and put them in the church storage. On account of he didn't know who to return them to. Thought you ought to know. She went to the church that afternoon and spoke with the current pastor, a calm young man named Theo Brandt, who had inherited the box along with the post in the building and seemed relieved to hand it to someone who had a connection, however tenuous, to the original owner. The box was not large. It held an account ledger, a receipt book, a small bag of glass bottle stoppers that she could not explain, and at the bottom, tied with a length of cord that had dried and stiffened to the texture of bark, a bundle of letters. She brought the box back to the cooperage and sat on the workbench to read them in the afternoon light from the south window, which now had its shutter rehung and was open to the breeze. The letters were from Henrick Claes' wife, Marta, written after she had left Harrow Bend. 12 letters in total, postmarked from 6 different towns across 3 states. Each one shorter than the last, each one moving further east. In the early ones, she wrote about Henrick, about the way he moved in the shop, about a particular song he sang under his breath while he worked, about the last morning before the flood, when the light on the river had been, she said, the exact color of his eyes. In the later ones, she wrote about other things. A job she had found, a town she had passed through, a woman she had befriended on a train platform in Ohio. In the last letter, postmarked Cincinnati, 1884, 5 years after she had left, she wrote a paragraph that made Orin stop reading and look out at the river for a long time before she could continue. I know I said I would never think about the shop again. I have not been very good at keeping that promise. I still think about the pattern he carved into that hearth stone. Did you know he told me he carved it there so it would never burn? He said, a man's knowledge ought to outlast him. I believed him then, and I believe him now, but I have not been back to find out. Tell me someone is there. Tell me someone has found it. There was no date on which the letter had been written, no return address. No one had answered it, or if they had, the reply was not in the box. Orin sat very still with the letter in her hands. She thought about Marta Claes, who had walked out of this building in grief, so heavy it could not be stayed or reasoned with, the same way a river cannot be reasoned with in flood, who had moved through 6 towns, and finally stopped somewhere in Ohio, and written letters to an empty address, hoping someone would answer, who had specifically, at the end, asked about the pattern carved into the hearthstone, asked if someone had found it, as though the survival of that knowledge was the last thread connecting her to the life she had left. She looked at the slate on the workbench. She had kept it there for 3 months, glancing at it every morning when she began work. She had not thought until this moment to consider what it had meant to the people who left it there. That it was not just a diagram. That it was, in Henrick Claes's words, a man's knowledge that he had intended to outlast him. It had. 14 years and a flood and 4 families who had not looked down far enough. It had outlasted all of it. She folded Marta's letter carefully and held it in her hands for a moment. Then she did something she had not done in a long time. She went to the south window and looked out at the river. The late afternoon light was on it, turning the water a color she did not have a word for. Amber, but lighter, with something golden running through it. A heron, or perhaps the same heron, stood motionless at the far bank. She thought, "Tell me someone is there," she thought. Someone is there. She was not able to write back to Henrick Claes. There was no address, and Cincinnati was a large city, and 20 years was a long time. But she did the next best thing. She had Theo Brandt, the pastor, help her compose a notice that was published in the Harrow Bend Courier and 2 neighboring county papers, that the Claes cooperage on the Sallow River was operating again, that the carved hearthstone pattern of H. Claes had been preserved and was on display in the shop, and that any family of Henrick or Marta Claes was welcome to see it and to know that their work had not been lost. No one answered. But the act of sending the notice mattered more than she could have explained to anyone at the time. It was a way of saying, "I found it. It is here. Someone is here." The notice also, incidentally, had the practical effect of reminding the surrounding county that the cooperage was open for business. Orders increased. By the following spring, the overhang was rebuilt. She and Webb Sorrells raised it in a single, long Saturday, with Calvin Fitch doing the slower work of handing up boards and giving commentary. And the covered workyard was functioning as intended, giving her a sheltered outdoor space for the larger coopering work and for the occasional iron job too big to manage inside. She had hired a young man from town, a quiet 14-year-old named Abner, who came 3 afternoons a week and did what she told him and asked the right kind of questions. Not "Why do I have to do this?" but "Why does that work that way?" She saw in his careful attention something she recognized. She taught him the way Clement Dre had taught her. By doing the thing correctly and setting the work back in front of him. Petra Stovall had taken to stopping by on Thursday mornings, officially to see if there were any deliveries to coordinate, unofficially to sit on the bench outside the south window with a cup of coffee and watch the river while Orin worked inside. They did not always talk. They did not need to. One Thursday in April, Petra said, "My husband couldn't make anything stay fixed. He tried. He just couldn't hold a thought long enough." She paused. "You're not like that." Orin set down her hammer. "No," she said. "I'm not." Petra nodded as though something had been confirmed. She finished her coffee and went back to the store. On an evening in late April, a year and a week after, she had walked into the land office with $9 and a center punch and asked if there was anything for sale that nobody wanted. Orin Voss sat on the threshold of the Claes cooperage and looked at the river. The shop behind her smelled of iron and wood smoke and the particular dry warmth of a working fire. The hearthstone slate, cleaned and remortared into its proper place in the hearth, caught the last of the day's light through the open door. The pattern H. Claes had carved into it in 1874 was clearly visible. The precise curve of the stave bend, the measurements in their small, deliberate numerals, the knowledge of a careful man set into stone so it would last. On the workbench, next to the account book where she recorded her orders and materials and accounts, 2 objects sat side by side. One was the center punch Clement Dre had made for her. The iron body was the same. The buffalo horn grip was, if anything, slightly darker from the months of use, more fully itself, the way tools become more themselves as they are used. It had drilled the rivet holes in every hoop she had made in the past year. It had marked the cuts on every stave. It had gone with her every morning into the work. The other was the river slate. She had made a small wooden ledge for it on the workbench, so it sat upright and visible. H. Claes, 1874. The diagram was as clear as the day he had scratched it. The 2 objects together made a kind of sentence that she had not been able to say out loud to anyone, but that she understood completely. This is what we have been given, and this is what we owe. She thought about what it meant to inherit something from people who could not leave it to you directly. Clement Dre had left her his knowledge and a note, and the precise balance of a tool made for her hand. Henrick Claes had left the building, and the fire hearth and the pattern in the stone. Marta Claes had left the letters and the question. Tell me someone is there. None of them had known her. Not one of them had planned for her. Specifically, they had simply done their work as carefully and honestly as they could, and set it into the most durable form they could find, and trusted that it would reach someone. It had reached her. The river was running soft tonight, the kind of sound that makes the air around it feel slower and quieter than anywhere else. The cottonwoods along the bank had come into their new leaves, and they moved in the light evening wind with the paper-dry rustling that she had come to love, the way you come to love. All the sounds of a place that is yours. She had $9 once, and she had given them all away at once for a place that nobody wanted, and it was the finest transaction of her life. She thought of Marta Claes asking, across 20 years and however many miles of silence, "Tell me someone is there." She closed her eyes and very quietly told her. We wonder about that sometimes, the things we leave behind without knowing we have left them. A tool, a pattern, a letter, a building still standing after 14 years. What do we carry forward from the people who shaped us? What have we left, without knowing it, for someone who will come later and need exactly that? What have you found of value in a place, or a person, that the rest of the world had already given up on? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know.